Jason is the Kowalski Family Teaching Specialist for Digital Archaeology in the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials, otherwise known as CAM, which is a joint endeavor between the Penn Museum and the University of Pennsylvania's School of Arts and Sciences for teaching and mentorship in the archaeological sciences. Jason is a landscape archaeologist who specializes in the use of remote sensing and spatial analysis to investigate how people of the past interacted with and transformed the landscapes they occupied. Jason maintains research projects in Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean, where he studies ancient settlement patterns and urbanism. Jason also conducts a community archaeology project here in Pennsylvania, documenting Black burial spaces in partnership with historic preservation professionals and cemetery stewards, a topic he presented in an Archaeology in Action lecture 1 year ago, and I'm sure some of you were here to see that as well. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, my colleague, Jason Herrmann, who will talk about the shape of Punic cities. Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for joining me tonight. Yes, today I'm going to talk about how I'm using my skills as a landscape archaeologist to map the surface and near subsurface of ancient Motya, located in Western Sicily. We'll see a few maps that describe it. We're going to talk about the methods we've applied, how these answer some of our research questions, what the greater significance of our findings are, and show their findings at the end. I'll also introduce the Center for Analysis of Archaeological Materials in the end, which has been just a wonderful place to work, a fantastic resource for Penn students, Penn faculty, and people outside where we can help them apply, learn archaeological science methods, and also, give you some hints on how you can follow our progress at Motya and on other projects down the road. So without further ado, let's take a trip to ancient Motya. If I can advance the slide. So if you were to approach ancient Motya, located in Western Sicily, in the 5th century BC, you would take a road, now called the submerged road, Strada Submersa, but you would take a road that was built to span the 1.75 kilometer stretch between the Sicilian mainland and what is now called Isla San Pantaleo. This island sits in a protected bay, and in the 5th century BCE, it had a monumental fortress, fortifications surrounding the whole thing, and it was probably, and we'll show later on, a city absolutely packed with houses and streets, temples, small plazas. To get there, you would pass through a fortified gate with 3 kind of passes as you go in. And one of the first things you would encounter is a monumental temple called the Cappadatsu. So you pass through the Strada Submersa, across the Strada Submersa, through Porta Nord. You'd go past the Cappadatsu, and if you traverse the whole island heading to the south, as this photo is facing, you would eventually reach an area called the Koton, which is has been interpreted as a sacred pool, protected by a ceremonial wall and surrounded by temples, which I'll discuss in a little bit. All of these monuments were elaborated with sculptures, like you can see here. There's in the Whitaker Museum now, they have these 2 lions that were attacking a bull, which was probably mounted on top of the North Gate. What the island is now is a park held by a private foundation, the Whitaker Foundation. And if you guys have not had the pleasure of visiting Western Sicily and taking the short ferry ride out to Motya to walk through the vineyards and see the archaeological remains, I highly, highly recommend it. And if you do it in June, maybe we could say hello. But in the past, Motya was absolutely full of a variety of activities that demonstrated both its Levantine roots, and I'll discuss that in a little bit, and its contact with people who were native Sicilians and ethnic Greeks. So Motya was a Punic city, and I'll discuss a little bit more who Punic people were, but to introduce them first, they're descendants of people from modern-day Lebanon and Israel, who were Phoenicians that traversed the breadth of the Mediterranean Ocean, Mediterranean Sea, establishing settlements primarily in central and western Mediterranean. Motya was one of their settlements that was probably first occupied in the latter part of the 8th century BCE. And the people who stayed there and their descendants who went on to live in the city maintained some traditions that came from the Levant. Some of them appeared in industrial installations, like the types of kilns they used. Some of them appeared in their religious practices, communicated through stelae, communicated through these sculptures that decorated their burials and their monuments. But also we have evidence of influence and contact and integration with people from other parts of the Mediterranean, not just native Sicilians who came to live at Motya side by side with descendants of the Phoenician colonists, but also ethnic Greeks from Eastern Sicily, perhaps people from mainland Italy, also perhaps people from modern-day Iberia. And we can see this all in the artifact assemblage that we find at Motya today. It was part of a constellation of important Punic cities, people who shared this Canaanite heritage, who spoke a Semitic language that came from modern-day Lebanon and modern-day Israel, and went on to kind of evolve into their own culture. We use this word Punic and Phoenician sometimes interchangeably, but there is no firm definition for how to distinguish one of these from the other. But if you were to try to define them, you could say that Punic kind of has two overlapping definitions. One would be the cultural affiliation with people who were most closely related to the people who lived at Carthage and occupied the central Mediterranean. The other would be Phoenician descendants who existed in the Mediterranean, in this central and western Mediterranean after the 6th century BCE. So there's kind of a Venn diagram there, and they overlap in that in the 6th century BCE, this constellation of Punic cities began to flourish, partly in response to the growth of Greek settlements in southern Italy and eastern Sicily, partly as part of a kind of zeitgeist across the Mediterranean of the establishment of kind of these urban centers. So a lot of Punic cities that exist or that are known now are in northern Africa, in western and southern Sardinia, up here on the left, but then also a couple here in western Sicily, Motya, perhaps most important among them. Here's just an image of, a beautiful stamp that shows kind of the flow of people out of the Eastern Mediterranean, bringing, this distinct culture out to Western and Central Mediterranean. We also can see here a depiction of how Motya sits in this protected bay. Motya is this island here on the right. It sits between modern-day Marsala and modern-day Trapani, the two major cities of Western Sicily. And it's protected by a long, low island called Isola Longa. This one's actually mislabeled, it seems. And you can see the path of the causeway that connected ancient Motya with the mainland. When that causeway was established in the 6th century BC, as when all of the trappings of urban Motya were kind of elaborated, activity and parts of the city and the culture and establishment expanded to the mainland itself in this area called Birgi, which is the modern name for that area. These people Phoenician people and Punic people coexisted side by side with another great expansion of culture, the Greek culture. So we can see here kind of dividing up the Mediterranean between areas where Phoenicians tended to have established bases and areas where Greek people also had established bases. What I have marked here are the locations of important Punic cities in black. Some of them even face the Atlantic Ocean, as you can see in Lixus and modern-day Carthage over here on the left. One big difference between Greek settlement and Punic settlements, this is not totally the case, but one kind of generalization you can make is that Punic cities were often hubs of trade. So they did not necessarily extend into the hinterland. They did not conquer vast expanses of fields and establish agricultural centers, but rather were places where goods were transferred across the Mediterranean back and forth, looking for, say, silver from Iberia or drawing wool and grain from farmers in Sicily and in North Africa and transferring them back and forth across the Mediterranean. This is distinct from kind of the Greek settlement pattern where they would establish a chora. They would have mapped out and regulated farmlands sitting behind the cities that they established in the colonies they established in the Eastern Mediterranean. Here's a timeline just showing you the kind of life of Motya. In the beginning, before the Phoenician colonists arrived, there was a Bronze Age occupation on the site. Bronze Age native Sicilians, very small signal, but not one nonetheless. These were ethnic Elymian people, one of three cultural groups identified in Sicily. When the Phoenician colonists show up, Motya was not a grand city at the beginning, but rather a small unfortified trading post. In the 6th century BCE, though, as I mentioned, it blossomed into a massive city, and this growth required a lot of labor, it required a lot of investment, and it required a lot of people. At the end of the 5th century BCE, beginning of the 4th century, in 397 BC, rival Greeks from modern-day Syracuse, led by Dionysius I, laid siege to Motya, and after a few days of battle, destroyed the city. They destroyed the city, they came in, and by the accounts, they killed everyone in the city or enslaved people who remained. This, in some accounts, is the end of Motya, and it's treated as maybe this island was never occupied again. That is actually not true. There was a reoccupation of this landscape by Carthage soon after the siege when the Greek troops withdrew, and they established a major site seen here in the background of this image on modern-day site of modern-day Marsala, with the ancient name of Lilybeo. People still occupied Motya too, as sort of maybe the suburbs of Lilybeo, reusing this space and occupying it in some smaller fashion, not in the intense way it was in the 6th century BC. It was never, though, anything close to what it appeared at its kind of apogee. And so there was sporadic occupation by small groups in the Roman period, with the establishment of one or two houses. In the Arab periods, just the same. In the 11th and 12th century, some monks set up a little monastery on the site, and that's who the site is named for, San Pantaleo. It comes from the establishment of the monastery then, and then some Jesuits later on. But occupation at the site was nothing near what it was at its height, which may have hosted, 1,500 people or more at that time. One of the things about looking at Punic cultures is that we need to try to understand who they are and what their lifestyle was without the benefit of hearing it from their own voice. So there are lots of Punic inscriptions. There are even Punic records written in Punic language, which is a descendant of Canaanite languages. But these are mostly very repetitive dedications to gods, some very rote record keeping, not descriptive histories like the Greeks were writing at the same time. So most of what we know from how people occupied Motya, the people who lived there, and also at other Punic centers, we know from their rival Greeks, oftentimes from historians who were recounting these things, 100, 200 years later. And so we really have to rely on the material record to see who they were, how they lived their life, how they identified, and how they carried forward and what their social organization was, and how they planned these things. We can see very strong connections with the people who occupied Motya, with their forebears from the Levant, in the establishment of temples that resemble the temples of their ancestors from modern-day Lebanon and Israel. This has been the focus of work from a team from La Sapienza in Rome, where they identify how some of these temples surrounding the Koton, what we're looking at here on the left is the Koton, the sacred pool of Motya down in the south, surrounded by these temples that were elaborated through time and persisted and have all of the trappings of what you call a Punic or Phoenician temple. We can also see it in the completely separate practice in industry, in the shapes of the kilns and their ceramic practice. Here we're looking down into a kiln. They have a kind of a flue here and a little table where you could set stuff up on. You fire things. These kilns are also directly connected to the same kind of practice by ceramicists from centuries before the establishment of Motya in modern-day Lebanon, in modern-day Israel. So we can see the connections through both the disparate practices of religion and industry. We also, though, as we saw in the earlier slide with some of the masks and some of the items, we also, though, see a lot of signs of influence from Greek, either through contract, through trade. They are in Sicily, which was which had very strong, I would say, Greek presence at that time. And one of the more famous objects of Greek culture is the Charioteer of Motya, a masterpiece sculpture. If you have the chance to see, I know it's toured around the world a little bit. It does not have, does not show the hand of the Punic artist, but rather the Greek artist, showing Greek styles. And we don't know if this was not found in its original position. And we don't know if this sculpture came from Motyan conflict with their Greek neighbors, or if it came from a Greek presence on Motya who we know were living side by side with ethnic Punic people. And we know this through the material culture. We know this through the historical accounts from later on. So this is just to paint a picture of us wondering, who were the Punic people of Motya? How were they culturally distinct? trying to give voice to kind of the ethnic makeup of Motya and how did this multicultural city really look. Here's a picture of the siege of Motya. I'm going to skip through that. And so what we wanted to do to investigate this is identify a lot of the residential areas. So what I've shown you a lot now, up to now, I've talked about monuments like fortification walls, the North Gate, temples, but what we haven't really have a good picture of is a lot of the domestic contexts. We know that to build the city, they had to bring in large amounts of people. We know from historical accounts that Motya was a multicultural town. We know from the material record that also Motya had trappings of indigenous Greek, indigenous Sicilian, perhaps some Iberian, definitely a North African influence. How are all these people living side by side? So what we did is we took a landscape approach to identify residential areas. We wanted to understand what the shape of this city was, how was it laid out, and try to understand, is there a distinctive picture of what an urban Punic center looks like? We don't know this. We don't know this because, and if you allow me to go back, we don't know this because a lot of the major Punic cities, Carthage, which is now under modern-day Tunis, Cadiz, ancient Gadir, most of these other ones scattered all around, they are underneath perhaps Greek cities that came after, perhaps Roman cities that came after, perhaps modern cities like Tunis and Cadiz that came after. So all of them offer a very spotty picture of Punic remains. They've been destroyed. People will dig up old remains to reuse the materials. They're completely covered over by modern urbanism. But Motya is unique in that it was pretty much destroyed and then mostly abandoned. I pointed out that it wasn't actually abandoned, but it was not transformed in the way that these other cities were. So it offers a unique view into what the Punic urban form really looks like. So we're working together with University of Pennsylvania is working together under a larger University of Palermo-led project with my friend and colleague Paolo Sconzo, who is actually sitting in the next room, listening to me and probably taking notes of the things I'm getting wrong. She's also a consulting scholar at the Penn Museum. She and I have had been collaborators on multiple projects for more than 10 years. So we bring students together and work together every summer at Motya. So we're interested in the urban shape. We're interested in identifying urban traditions, connecting them with perhaps Levantine urban traditions, perhaps defining a Punic urban tradition, or maybe connecting them with Greek urban traditions and seeing how was this society informed by these other kind of cultures. Other people have also thought about this in the past. Motya, scientific investigations at Motya started in the mid-60s. And since then, people have been thinking about how the city might have been laid out. What we have here on the left and the right are two depictions of the island. On the left, we have a mosaic of aerial photographs that show how it's being used now. It's mostly covered with vineyards. Motya actually produces award-winning Grillo. So if you're into wine, I suggest you look that up. I can give you a recommendation later if you want to find out. But this also gives us a picture of what it is like to access these archaeological remains today. In some of these forested areas, it's a little bit difficult. In these vineyards, and maybe a little easy in these open areas, even more so. On the right, we have an elevation map derived from a LiDAR survey done by the Italian government, I think sometime in the last 5 years. And on top of it, we've drawn all of the excavated contexts that have been published by not just the University of Palermo team, by the teams that came before from Rome and many other places. And what we can see here is that we don't have a good picture of how all of these parts connect. We can see the fortification wall. We can see the Koton sacred area and the temples that surround it. We get a little pictures of what's going on in the middle. Here's a major temple, the Kaparatsu, industrial area out here. But we don't really have a good picture of how these things all connect. So this is where I come in. Well, first, before we talk about that, let's talk about people have used this information to kind of come up with ideas of what Motya must have looked like as a city. And here we can see two different views. This one by Isserlin and Duplat Taylor show Motya with some general excavation areas, and they proposed, in this diagonal line cutting through, a central access road that cut through the whole site and defined it. Now, this is not something that has been proven until now, but you can see they were kind of on the right track with a kind of linear division through them. This shows Isserlin was relying on the evidence he saw on the ground, but it also shows sort of an openness toward a orthogonal, rectilinear, very ordered pattern that's generally associated with Greek and Roman cities. On the right, however, we see another imagined view of Motya. This one comes from the museum on the site itself, which gives kind of a more Orientalist picture of what the site might have looked like. It would be wrong to say it's not ordered because there is an order to it. It's just not orthogonal and rectilinear, like you would see in a Greek and Roman site. It seems to have a central plaza in the middle. You can see the Koton sacred complex over here on the left. You can see Porta Nord here on the right, Porta Nord here on the left, and fortification walls surrounding it. So ideas by different scholars publishing over time have kind of gone back and forth between these two models for what Motya looked like in the past. So this is where I come in. We apply a landscape approach to understanding the site. And in archaeology, when you say a landscape approach, it usually infers the use of remote sensing technologies. So you'll see a lot about remote sensing technologies in the next lecture. I also 1 year ago presented how we're using remote sensing technologies to document and recover a lot of Black cemeteries surrounding Philadelphia. Remote sensing technologies are not just limited to the geophysical techniques you can see on the slides on the top, on the images on the top, but also could be aerial and satellite pictures, things like the LiDAR that I showed before, but also kind of extensive survey techniques overall. Here in the center, we have a picture of people doing surface collection, collecting artifacts on a grid to understand the distribution of artifacts that we find on the surface. Here we are examining some of those artifacts as they come in from the field. And we also, of course, had to dig some holes to verify our results, some test excavation on the left. We're not the first ones at Motya to either take a landscape approach. There were geophysics at Motya, geophysical investigations at Motya as early as 1964 by a team from Leeds University in the UK. So you can see here, their results were difficult to interpret. In fact, I need to go through them more closely and see if we can see how they might fit with modern things. There's also been stuff in the last decade by the team from Rome, which is a little bit difficult to interpret, but seems useful nonetheless. You can see here on the right, one of their published images. And I have some references here, if it should interest anybody. So we applied multiple geophysical techniques to understand the distribution of, to start at least, to understand the distribution of things buried at or near the surface at Motya. Most of the archaeological deposits are found within 50 centimeters to 1 meter. Some of them can be as deep as 4 meters on the site. The first thing we'll concentrate on, and we'll come back to at the end, are the results from a magnetic survey. So geomagnetic survey is the most widely used approach in archaeology. There are a variety of instruments that can be used to collect it. What it does is it measures the strength of the Earth's magnetic field as it's influenced by things around it. So imagine a magnetic field flowing out of the Earth, and when that magnetic field encounters things that also have magnetism, that current moves, it is pushed out or pulled in, just like the kind of a flow of fluid, to become more intense in some places and less intense in other places. This depends largely on the presence of iron compounds in any materials that are buried in the sediments. This could be things that are natural. These could be things that are man-made. We move around iron-bearing sediments all the time as humans, all the time. We do it through earth moving. One of the ways which we enhance the magnetism of the site is just by removing or piling up topsoil. Anything that's organically rich, like topsoil, manure, anything like that, it's going to be enhanced with iron. And when we pile those things up, we'll have a stronger magnetic signature. Conversely, if we were to remove topsoil from an area, then we would have a lower magnetic signature, and that would show in contrast with maybe neighboring areas. We can also see things that are magnetically enhanced compared to the background by bringing something from afar that has a stronger magnetic signature than the context that you place it in. For example, if you're building with an igneous rock, something that bubbled out of the ground like basalt or granite, as a result of very active or very slow acting volcanic activity, that will have a strong magnetic signal. And if you place it in sand or sediment or river deposits, it will contrast in its magnetic signature quite strongly. The other way we can enhance magnetism is by firing something, kilns, ovens, the things that come out of them, piles of bricks, piles of ceramics. Those things have been heated up beyond what you call the Curie point. And at that point, the electrons loosen up, align to the magnetic north as it is oriented to at that very moment. And when they cool down, they're all locked in place and they become a strong magnet on their own. So if you heat things up over and over again, even if you make a fire on the ground, that hearth could show up. It would be magnetically enriched, and it would show up in a magnetic survey. So here's 3 ways in which humans would enhance the magnetism of their surroundings. And we're going to see all 3 of those in our results from Motya. The way we collect it is by moving this sensor back and forth across the landscape, and things that are induced that create a magnetic field in the presence of the Earth's magnetic field will generate a kind of a north and south pole. Things that have their own magnet, like piles of iron and organic deposit, will also generate a magnetic signal and influence the intensity of magnetism, and this device would record it. It's a passive instrument. It only reads what's there. It doesn't see depth. It doesn't see, you can't calibrate it to see deeper or farther. It just records what it's being exposed to at that very place. So the bottoms of these sensors are sensitive to the magnetism, and they just record the magnetism right there. So let's go back and see how it contributed to our work at Motya. Again, here is a picture of Motya. Here is the span of land between the excavations. Students from Penn, from the University of Tübingen, and the University of Palermo all contributed to this over the years. And what we were able to do is cover most of the areas that are open and free to access. You can see Jack Clark here walking back and forth across the field. This is one of the better conditions on the site, by the way. But you can see you need space to move with this thing. It's directionally sensitive, so you need to hold it straight. So we could only limit it to places like open fields, some of the vineyards, roads, and things like that. And our results at the end look like this. It's a map of positive and negative magnetism over the site. The black would be negative magnetism, and the South Pole, and the white would be the positive magnetism, the North Pole of the magnet. And what you're interested in looking at here is the intensity of the black or the white as a signal for enhanced magnetism. And then the background gray is places where the magnetism is rather neutral. And if you look at this, maybe the longer you look at this, some patterns start to come out with you, but you might see these lines dividing up the whole site going like this. We have some interpretation, of course. We're going to focus on the north east to begin with. But here's our interpretation. We'll come back to it at the end. At Motya, we were able to verify Isserlin's proposal that there's a central access road. We crossed it at 1, 2, 3 spots, and we can see that it connects throughout. So the dark places here are places where the interpretation is pretty secure, and the kind of light areas are places where I'm extending our interpretation based on our results, and those are things we'll verify in future seasons. The next thing you see is that the site is divided up evenly in these alleys that run perpendicular to the access road. Totally unexpected for Motya. Many have published, in fact, that at least they say, at least Motya doesn't have a grid, but we've shown surprisingly that it does. And it's extra surprising based on the fact that the contexts that people have investigated thus far don't really betray any sort of grid over the whole site. You can see they're just kind of randomly scattered, and you can understand why people wouldn't assume there's a grid on site. The other thing we can see is that there's a ring road following, at least for part of it, following the interior of the fortification wall. We can see it down here. I think it's right here. I think that these alleys actually should be cut off and the ring road should go in. So there's a ring road on the inside of the fortifications and then a lattice grid inside. Finally, you can see all these red dots. These red dots are areas where there was what we'll call pyrotechnic activity. They were probably kilns or ovens. Now, we don't know the date of any of these things just by looking at the geophysics. It doesn't tell us the date. It just tells us where things were more or less magnetic over the site. And then it's our job to kind of tease out when these different magnetic deposits were laid in the past. So let's go over some parts of the site and try to tease out a little bit more what we're talking about here. I'm going to talk about the area that we did in this open space, which is now all vineyards, but this open space actually was really easy to survey. We did it in 2017. Here are the results. They are the clearest on the whole site, partly because of the way I was able to survey it and because we were unobstructed by the vegetation. And maybe it's tough to look at, but remember, the intense white or the intense black is what you're interested in. Those show intense magnetism, and maybe the longer you're looking at it, you can see how these things are divided up by alleys and probably even further by other things. I've also put in here some drawings of the excavations that have been exposed in the past, including that major temple, the Kabadatsu. Up here on the upper right is the gate that comes in and the street that passes through, and some industrial area over here in Zone T. One thing we can see are the locations of lots of small walls dividing up the site. And don't worry, it will get less visually confusing in a minute. Here you are. Now, these are open to like a little bit of revision. Some of this stuff needs to be verified through excavation if we're ever allowed. But right now we're able to build kind of a picture of how these walls divided up in this northeast section. We can also see that these walls comprise these long segmented buildings that are about 20 meters wide and 100 meters long and divided into 4 or 5 equal parts throughout. It's probably improper to call them insulae. That's a Roman term, right? It's a Latin term. We'll call them segmented buildings here, but you can also call them insulae. Just don't tell anybody. These are obviously, these are very likely houses, and we can see how they're divided up inside. And we know that there is one other segmented building just like it excavated on the site, which is actually at a little different orientation, almost perpendicular to these. It was excavated in the 1990s and published in 2002 by a professor named Herrmann in Italy. One interesting thing about the building that she excavated and the buildings that we can see here is the slight changes of angle from segment to segment in these larger buildings. In their excavations, you can also see that these segments, different segments, were not just built of different stone, but also to different construction styles. And this is echoed in the shape of the buildings that we were able to expose in the magnetometry. This indicates that these were built individually by different people, probably in lots that they were given when they came to the city. They brought their own construction styles. They had different means of obtaining stone. Some of them may have been 2-story. Some of them may have been a modest 1. So that's interesting, right? You can see that there's a slight change in angle from segment to segment going throughout. We can also see the course of the central axis road. We can see a secondary road defining the sort of north end of these segmented buildings. The central axis road defines the south end of the Kapadatsu complex. And we can see the ring road in the magnetometry too, which bounds the south part of the industrial area and mirrors the course of the fortification walls on the outside. Between these segmented buildings, we have strong magnetic anomalies that indicate the presence of alleyways that divided them. We can also see very slightly a bit of history that was recorded during the siege of 397 BC. Here it is, and maybe you'll have to believe me, I'm turning it on and off. There is a line in the magnetometry that is a continuation of a feature that was excavated in Zone K, which is a hastily built pile of rubble pulled from other places, which was interpreted as a secondary line of defense against the Syracusan Greeks when they attacked Motya. And in that pile of rubble is where people found the charioteer of Motya, the youth of Motya. It was in there. So we know it's in a secondary position. It was kind of like buried under some other stones. The soil that was thrown on top of it actually broke some of the head off of the body. The arms had been broken off and had been broken off the base, but the pressure of the sediments that they thrown on top as they built up this fortification wall is what broke the head from the torso and what allowed archaeologists to reconstruct them and put them back together. So we put that all together and we can see a pretty clear picture of what's going on in the northeast corner of the site. We can see the locations of some kilns. We can see the alleyways. We can see the ring roads themselves. So we are getting a much more ordered view of the site of Motya than people anticipated in the past. This ordered view can be connected to Mediterranean cities, stretching back in time, but also from the east to the west end of Mediterranean. Something shared by cultural Greeks, but also showing up in some ordered plans in North Africa, like here at Kerkuan, shown 6th century Beirut, and here's ours in the bottom right. we can see that this gridding did not extend over the entire site. There is one little part that seemed to have been saved from the establishment of the grid system, and that's here in the east, down here in the bottom right picture, part of the image. Here, that buildings are a little bit more distributed. They feature a variety of forms. Some of them are clearly segmented buildings like we see above, like this one down here, but others are smaller shapes and seem to be oriented to the landscape rather than some imposed sense of order. They all surround a basin down here in the bottom, and one of the things we were trying to decide is if this basin was ancient or is it modern, something that somebody dug in the construction of some of the modern facilities of the site. But we don't see any archaeological features truncated by this basin very clearly, so we think it may be an ancient form. We applied some other technologies as well, which I won't talk about too much here. Ground penetrating radar, the celebrity geophysical technique. It has the advantage of being able to estimate depth, but the data collection and the data processing are very complex and time consuming. What it does is it sends radio waves down. As those radio waves encounter different textures, they are some parts of the energy are reflected back up to the receiver, other parts continue on down. And you might create a profile as you drag a radar sensor that looks something like this, showing the boundaries between different layers. Here's some boundaries here on the top, and locations of some spot reflections here on as these kind of arcs. Radar has been pretty helpful at Motya in the last couple of years too, exposing buried architecture you can see here, echoing some of the excavated areas, extending our map of the city, and working in places where we can't, maybe the magnetometer is not working very well. It's responsive to a completely different set of physical properties, right? Magnetism is influencing the magnetometry. This is seeing differences in texture. So we can see the buildings as they're arrayed throughout. And we can even use this information to make pseudo 3D displays like we have here, which kind of cross-sects a building that's buried. We also use electrical resistance survey, which is sensitive to variations in compaction, salt content, and moisture. And what you do is basically stick a big old fork in the ground over and over again and measure how that current, how easily that current passes through different parts. And then you basically paint by numbers in the end, and you can create a picture of what's going on underground. We use this and the radar, not just to extend the magnetic survey outside of places where we couldn't work, but to confirm some of our interpretations, like this intense magnetic feature, which we were unsure if it was on the surface or buried, but here we can see it was probably the location of a kiln or an oven near the middle of this building. We excavated to verify some of these things, and I'll just skip ahead to show you some of our most salient results. They come in this area where we put a trench in to bisect, to kind of catch the wall of one of these houses, one of these segmented buildings, but also the alleyway. And the alleyway was super informative because it's made up of sherds pressed into crushed lime called cacio pesto. And we could see as we dug that these roads had 3 or 4 laminations. That means they were repaired and relaid 3 or 4 times. And in each one of these separate laminations, each one of these separate repair episodes, they had distinct temporally diagnostic pottery that we were able to show that the roads were in use for at least 80 years. We could see the beginning from the earlier sherds and the lower levels, and the last resurfacing episode, which occurred some 80 years later. So this basically spanned the 5th century BCE. That means we can date basically the whole grid just by a couple little trenches touching that cacio pesto road. because we can assume that that grid was established and laid all at the same time. We also investigated some of the pyrotechnic features, and this showed that some of the kilns that were established in the site actually were set by those people from modern-day Marsala, Lilibeo, after the siege of Motya, where they reused the city as sort of an industrial outpost rather than a place to live. Surface collection helped us to date some of the features. We basically covered the collected artifacts at regular intervals over the land surface, and then connected those spatially with the geophysical buildings, the buildings we could see in the geophysical data. I'm going to skip ahead, though, because we're running out of time. One of the things we could see, though, from this surface collection is the duration of use of different parts of the landscape. In these earlier phases, we have very scattered but even use. And clearly during the intense Punic phase, again, scattered, well-distributed deposits across the site. But we can see in these later periods, in the 4th century BCE, this eastern area where it's off the grid probably was a little better represented. And then even later with the Roman period, mostly confined to the area around the Caparazzo in the northeast. But the most intense work at Motya, the most intense deposits archaeologically are between the 5th and the first half of the 4th century BC. So to round up what we've seen here, we can see that when this site was established in the 6th century, people moved in quite rapidly and transformed the whole landscape by establishing a grid that did not conform with earlier sediment patterns. That doesn't mean they totally disregarded their roots. This settlement was anchored on a central axis road that connected the Koton and temples and the Caparazzo. Both of these temples, our colleagues from Rome will argue, are part of the initial settlement at Motya and part of their Canaanite Levantine ancestry, part of their heritage. So when they established a grid to kind of rewrite the site and set up all this, these intense occupation, they made sure to incorporate the ideas of the past in the new orientation of the city. But what we also see here are some hallmarks of other Punic cities like Kerkuan, and some cities in some settlements that we can see in Sardinia. Also settlements that we see in the Levant, where these people came from. These hallmarks are a ring road, which we will not find in a Greek city. These hallmarks are small plazas, like we can find on either side of the Caparazzo. And the lack of a large central plaza, which is a hallmark of a Greek city, the agora. So we can see the people at Motya were integrating ideas from the past in the way they oriented their city, and they were also being influenced by the people who they were in and around, by bringing in some Greek ideas like this ordered plan, and blending it with distributed small plazas and a ring road that surrounds it. So we can see continuity with the past and also some discontinuity with the past. But the placement of the central road, while not a Punic feature, is anchored on Punic foundations. These two. So just to touch it up, we see a Punic city plan, small dispersed plazas, the lack of a central agora. Those are clear hallmarks of a Punic settlement. But what we don't see in other Punic settlements, which were very few, as I noted before, is the presence of a very strong ordered grid and the presence of a strong axis road that anchors it. So what does this mean? This means that first we want to connect it to some of the Punic sites. Kerkuan is one of the few preserved Punic cities. in northern Africa, in Tunisia, modern-day Tunisia, near the coast, which kind of resembles Motya in its plan. We have a ring road. We have not as strictly ordered, but the presence of these segmented buildings that are also ordered. They don't seem to be divided up by the alley in the same way they do at Motya. We can also connect this to sites in modern-day Israel, Beersheba, for example, ring road, fortification walls, segmented and ordered buildings within. So we have the parts of the past, and we have this gridded plan from their contemporaries elsewhere in Sicily and the Mediterranean, most of the Greeks. This signature, we are beginning to argue, may be a Sicilian expression of punicity, a special Motyan flavor of urbanism. One of the peculiar things about Punic settlements and Punic people across the Mediterranean is they are multicultural and they tend to integrate ideas of the people around them. There is a very distinct flavor of Sardinian Punic cities. Likewise, there is a very distinct flavor of Iberian Punic settlements. One that has not been built is the distinct flavor of Sicilian Punic settlements, but we hope to be moving that way with understanding this urban plan. So with that, I'll close and take a moment to thank many of the organizations that have supported us over the years, including the Penn Museum, but also the University of Palermo. We've funded this through the Gerda Henkel Stiftung, a German organization, the University of Tübingen, the International Society for Archaeological Prospection, and we received a grant from ASOR in this last year. We've also developed these ideas and could not have done any of this work with the fantastic teams at Motya over the last 6 years, really. And then I want to also take this moment to plug CAM, the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials. Watch what we're doing because things are getting more and more exciting. As my colleagues, all archaeological specialists, are doing fantastic things in Southeast Asia, here in the United States, in the Levant, in Greece, in Jordan, in the Andes. Really wonderful things by wonderful people. So with that, I will close. I should also invite you to our CAM annual showcase. This is we're now past it, CAM's 10th birthday. And we are going to celebrate it by bringing back by showcasing some of our work by students and former students in CAM at the end of April. And if you're in Philadelphia, you're all invited to join us and see some of the amazing research that we're doing. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jason. That was really interesting. Of course. We have one question in the chat, but if anyone has a question, feel free to place them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I can read them to Jason. So Jason, our first question is, what kind of religion did the Punic society practice, and how would you discern a temple or a house of worship?
Yeah, so they carried on religious practices from the Levant. There are several deities who they were had regular kind of devotions to. These temples were elaborated. I would say Baal, Melkart, Astarte are all they have Greek and Roman analogs, but these are Levantine-born deities. They were revered in temples. There were dedications of various sorts in these temples, including offerings. There were statuary, some of them that were found in these temples, if we talk about in the Kotlan. The material culture is not my thing as a landscape archaeologist, but here we can look at some of this stuff. But these temples were definitely more ornate. They probably held sculptural materials. Some of them still preserve plinths. In others, they would have fragmented bits of sculpture that came out of them. There's also fairly good evidence for there being a statue in the middle of the koton itself, with some feet down. But they carried on a version of religious practice that you would find in the early Iron Age and Bronze Age in modern day Lebanon and Syria.
Yes, thank you. Jason, what brought you to these excavations?
What brought me to this was an invitation from Palace Gonzo in 2015 or 16. She and I were at the University of Tübingen together, and I was working for her on a project, a survey in Iraqi Kurdistan. And she was like, why don't we try a geophysical survey at Motya? So we got some money to do it, and it snowballed from there.
Right place, right time. Yeah. Can you say more about that pool? More about the pool, where the pools were found in those Punic cities?
This pool.
Yeah, I think so. More to
Yeah,
say
so the
about that
Koton,
pool.
yeah, so this pool, Carthage has massive versions of this, which were places to dock and repair ships. And you know, Phoenician and Punic people are best known for being seafarers. And so the movement in the water and the use of water in the ships is obviously plays a very large role in their life. When this area was first excavated by Ursuline, this pool was interpreted as also being a place to moor ships, to bring them in for repairs or dock them. I don't think that that is very accepted these days, because the channel to get to the Koton right here is extremely shallow and narrow. And so now the Rome team who works in this part of the island pushes very strongly for a ceremonial sacred interpretation for the site. And there have been several by the same team. One of them would be just a decorative pool with they found a plinth with some feet on it. The sculpture is not there. There was a sculpture found elsewhere in the lagoon surrounding the island that could be the one that was mounted here, but there might have been a sculpture mounted in the middle of the pool. A more recent article proposes that the pool was for stargazing, a reflective surface where you could see, you know, the constellations. I have a harder time believing that, because one, if you have something rising up out of the middle of the pool, it kind of breaks that mirror. I have to say, when you're out there at night, it does reflect very well and things look beautiful. But I don't see how that's any easier than looking straight up. And if you have objects in it that would, you know, cause more ripples, I don't think that that would necessarily do the job.
Thank you. Interesting. Was there Punic presence during the Punic Wars with Rome?
Here, no,
Yeah.
there was Punic presence, but it was not a center. Those Punic Wars in Rome, Punic presence was both to the north and south of Motya at that time. So when Motya fell, Rome started to rise. Those things are not connected necessarily, but the rise of Rome came a little bit afterward, the abandonment of Motya.
Excellent. More questions for you about the basin. Did the temple have any astronomical orientation? Was there any evidence of a statue of Baal? Is it Baal?
In the middle of the
The
Koton.
basin? Yeah.
Yeah, in the middle of the pool, they argue that there's a statue of Baal. But the astronomical orientation, there hasn't been anything shown. One thing that you can see is when you stand at this end of the pool and look across it, there is a mountain called Erice on the horizon that its footprint pretty much matches the presence of the location of the pool itself.
Interesting. Jane caught on to something you mentioned just a few minutes ago. You said landscape archaeology is new to Jane. Could you mentioned material culture is not your thing. Can you explain a little more a bit about landscape archaeology?
Yeah. So my training is in how people occupied the landscape, how people use the land, and how maybe landscapes influence people. So landscape archaeology can take a lot of forms, but it usually intersects two things. It intersects understanding geomorphology, which is the distribution of soils, what soils can tell us about human activities in the past, distribution of how landscapes were transformed through agriculture, through settlement, through even passage through them. And then it can also use a lot of remote sensing techniques like I've shown here, drawing from kind of large scale views of the landscape through mapping responses to sensors like we had in this one, or just even aerial photos. So my training comes from, I came out of a program called Environmental Dynamics, where it was a joint anthropology and geography program, geosciences program, and we're interested in human relationships with the landscape. This would be both small scales, like changing a site over maybe decades or even centuries, or very long-term climate change influences on settlement and land use and access to resources in the deep past.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions for tonight? You have a moment to set them in the chat while we're waiting. Just thank you again, Jason, for sharing your work with us. We're really exciting. One of Jason's colleagues in CAM, Marie-Claude Beaulieu, will be speaking in the March lecture. So you can come to that and check out her work as well in Southeast Asia. That'd be great. Just seeing a couple things come up. Just great. Thank you for your great chat. All right. Well, with that, we'll say goodnight to everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Thank you all for attending.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.